Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In the previous lectures, we've been talking about culture in the 1980s. We've talked about the prominence of the Cold War, and we've also discussed the MTV generation and some of the great and memorable music of that era. In this lecture, we're going to move on to another element of culture, a fascination with outer space, which seeped through literature, film, television, and newsworthy events of the 80s. Perhaps Americans were drawn to the stars as fewer unexplained mysteries remained on Earth. Or perhaps an innate curiosity in the generation raised in the age of space exploration now permeated all of society. The various space missions, satellite probes, and powerful telescopes revealed new wonders and mysteries to explore. Or perhaps the troubles on planet Earth, and even the prospect of extinction of the human race through nuclear war, heightened the urgency of understanding the possibilities of space exploration and maintaining life elsewhere in the universe. Whatever the reasons, Americans in the 1980s were drawn to the stars as never before. One of the best movies of the decade was 1983's The Right Stuff, based on the 1979 novel by Tom Wolfe, which traced the evolution of the early space program from its roots among test pilots of the Navy, Marines, and Air Force. The film featured an all-star cast of young men who went on to become some of the leading actors of their generation, including Ed Harris as John Glenn, Dennis Quaid as Gordo Cooper, Scott Glenn as Alan Shepard, and Fred Ward as Gus Grissom. Aside from being an excellent and award-winning film, the movie also celebrated the manliness, heroism, and virtue of the test pilots come astronauts, and yet another landmark in the competition against the Soviet Union. Americans in the 80s also got to see the highs and lows of the space program itself. While the program had shifted its focus from the moon expeditions of the early 70s to unmanned satellites and probes, NASA returned to national prominence with the launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia on April 12, 1981. Unlike previous manned spacecraft, Columbia launched into orbit and returned to planet Earth completely intact, landing safely just as an airplane does. The prospect of commercial travel into outer space loomed, and the nation watched each space shuttle launch with fascination. This fascination turned to horror, however, on January 28, 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded only 73 seconds into its flight, the normal plume of liftoff turning into a fireball while still in sight of those watching on the ground and on television. All 7 astronauts on board were killed. Most poignantly, Christy McAuliffe, a civilian teacher selected as a great honor. The disaster put all NASA missions on hold for 2.5 years before the space shuttle took flight again in September 1988. Tragically, history repeated itself 15 years later, as the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded upon re-entering the atmosphere on its flight on February 1, 2003. Killing all 7 astronauts on board. That accident as well led to a 2-year freeze on NASA activities. Interest in astronomy and the universe was further sparked by the airing of an ambitious 13-episode miniseries called Cosmos, hosted and narrated by astronomer Carl Sagan, which aired from September through December of 1980. The PBS series employed new special effects, and Sagan's low-key demeanor drew in viewers. The series is the most watched public television series in the world, and was followed a year later by a best-selling book of the same title. In 1988, Stephen Hawking contributed to this popular fascination with the universe with his classic book, A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes. Hawking wrote in understandable and engaging language, addressing many of the mysteries of the universe, His book sold an amazing 25 million copies and was on the bestseller list for more than 4 years. Throughout the decade, a more irreverent intergalactic pop culture phenomenon flourished. The books, movies, comic books, and radio episodes of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which developed a cult following. The Hitchhiker's Guide, which eventually became what was dubbed a trilogy in 5 parts, followed the lone surviving human through his intergalactic travels after the Earth is destroyed by an alien race. Though light in tone, Hitchhiker also reflected deeper worries about the prospect of the end of the world and the human race. The interest in outer space was also sparked by the appearance of Halley's Comet, which was visible to the naked eye for a few days in 1986. The comet, which orbits the Sun every 75 years, will next be visible from Earth in the year 2061. Millions of Americans took the opportunity to purchase home telescopes, and an astronomy craze swept the nation. The interest in outer space was also reflected in Hollywood movies of the decade. The popularity of space-related films has a long history, but a string of blockbusters in the 1970s sparked further interest in space movies. As mentioned in a previous lecture, 1977's Star Wars created a frenzy and led to a series of sequels, several of which ranked among the biggest films of the 80s. The second film of the original Star Wars saga, 1980's The Empire Strikes Back, is widely regarded as the finest of all the Star Wars films. And the final film in the initial trilogy, 1983's Return of the Jedi, grossed more than $300 million at the box office, the second biggest film of the decade, behind only E.T. Also building on an already established franchise in the 1980s was Star Trek. The original television series first aired in 1966, but it remained popular in reruns for decades. By the late 1970s, the television series led to a series of films, the first of which was released in 1979. It was followed by The Wrath of Khan in 1982, The Search for Spock in 1984, The Voyage Home in 1986, and The Final Frontier in 1989. A huge fan following for the franchise inspired a new television series, The Next Generation, which aired from 1987 to 1994. Star Trek continues to spawn spin-off television shows and movies even today. The 1980s also saw the continued rise of Steven Spielberg, already one of the leading directors in Hollywood. And he capitalized on the national obsession with outer space with a series of films. His 1977 film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, based on a series of encounters in which human beings observe UFO activity before finally being taken aboard the alien spacecraft, was a smash hit, grossing more than $300 million. One of the top-grossing and most popular movies of the 1980s was Steven Spielberg's E.T., released in 1982. In the film, a young boy named Elliot befriends an alien being stranded on Earth when his ship inadvertently leaves him behind. The alien, nicknamed E.T. by Elliot, is completely peaceful and even has healing powers, but he's nearly killed by scientists who insist on capturing and studying him once his presence is revealed. The underlying message of the film is one of understanding and accepting others, and despite the somewhat cheesy heart light indicating E.T.'s emotions, the film was enormously popular. Outer space was also featured in several popular television series of the decade, including Battlestar Galactica, The Twilight Zone, and Buck Rogers, and children's shows like The Transformers and He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. In our next lecture, we'll turn to still another aspect of 1980s culture, the phenomenon known as yuppies.